A debt changes everything. A family's betrayal cuts deeper than any knife. When Clara's own blood puts her on the auction block like cattle, only one man dares to stand between her and a fate worse than death. But protecting her means war, and some wars cost more than a man can bear. The gavel cracked against the wooden podium like a gunshot, and Clara Hartwell felt her world shatter with it. She stood on the makeshift platform in the center of Millfield's dusty Main Street, her hands bound with coarse rope, her Sunday dress torn at the shoulder from where her own brother had dragged her from the wagon. The crowd below her buzzed with the kind of excitement that made her stomach turn. Men leaning forward in their chairs, eyes hungry and calculating, while their wives whispered behind gloved hands with expressions caught between horror and fascination. "Now, gentlemen," her father's voice boomed from beside the auctioneer, "as I explained, this arrangement settles our family's debt completely. Clara is 22, strong as an ox, can cook, clean, bear children, and she's never been touched by another man. The winning bidder gets a wife and a worker, guaranteed." His words hit Clara like physical blows. Thomas Hartwell, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders and told her she was his precious girl, now spoke of her like she was livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. Clara searched the crowd desperately, looking for even one friendly face, one person who might speak up for her. Her mother stood at the back, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she said nothing. Her brother Henry avoided her eyes entirely, his jaw set in that stubborn way that meant he'd already made peace with what they were doing. The townspeople she'd known her entire life watched with varying degrees of discomfort and interest, but no one moved to help her. No one except. "This is wrong." The voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk, deep and steady, and utterly without fear. Every head turned toward the man who had spoken, and Clara's heart jumped when she saw him. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his tall frame rigid with controlled anger, his dark eyes fixed on her father with an intensity that made several people step back. Clara had seen Jake around town for years, the lone rancher who lived in the mountains, who came to town only for supplies and kept to himself. She'd always thought he was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but she'd never spoken more than a few polite words to him. Now he was looking at her like she was the most important thing in the world, and Clara felt something flutter in her chest despite her terror. Thomas Hartwell's face darkened. "This is family business, Morrison. I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself." Jake stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden planks of the street. "Family business doesn't usually involve putting a woman up for auction like she's a prize heifer. What kind of debt could possibly justify this?" "The kind that's going to get my whole family killed if it's not paid," Thomas snapped, but Clara could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "We owe Marcus Blackwood $12,000, and he wants payment by sundown or he's coming for all of us. This is the only way." The name hit the crowd like ice water. Marcus Blackwood was the kind of man mothers used to frighten children into behaving, a lone shark and worse who controlled half the territory through fear and violence. Clara had heard whispers about the things he did to people who couldn't pay their debts, and suddenly her father's desperation made terrible sense. But Jake Morrison didn't seem intimidated by Blackwood's name. If anything, his expression grew harder. "So you decided to sacrifice your daughter instead of facing your own mistakes like a man." The words were quiet, but they carried across the silent crowd like thunder. Thomas's face went red. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Jake's voice rose, and Clara could see the fury building in him like a storm gathering strength. "How dare I point out that you're selling your own flesh and blood to save your worthless hide? That you're letting these vultures bid on her like she's property?" The crowd was getting restless now, some of the men muttering about wanting to get on with the bidding, others clearly uncomfortable with Jake's accusations. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Now if we could just proceed." "We're not proceeding with anything." Jake's words stopped the man cold. He walked closer to the platform, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. For a moment the chaos around them seemed to fade, and Clara felt like they were the only two people in the world. "Miss Hartwell," he said softly, "do you want this? Do you want to be sold to one of these men?" Clara's throat was so tight she could barely speak, but she managed to shake her head. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, I don't want this. I never wanted this." Jake nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Then he turned back to her father, and Clara had never seen such cold fury in a man's eyes. "Then this ends now." Thomas Hartwell pulled out a pistol, his hand shaking as he pointed it at Jake. "You don't understand, Morrison. Blackwood will kill us all if we don't pay him. All of us, including Clara. At least this way she has a chance at life, even if it's not the one she wanted." Jake didn't even flinch at the gun. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. $12,000, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd. "I'll pay Blackwood myself." The silence that followed was so complete Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Thomas stared at the pouch like it was a snake that might bite him. You don't have that kind of money. Nobody in these parts has that kind of money." Jake smiled, but it was a cold, dangerous expression. "I've got more money than you know what to do with, Hartwell. Mining claim up in the mountains has been paying off for years. The question is, are you going to take my money and let your daughter go free, or are you going to keep trying to sell her like cattle?" But even as hope flickered in Clara's chest, she saw her father's face change, saw the greed creep in where desperation had been. "Wait just a minute," Thomas said slowly, lowering his gun but not putting it away. "If you've got $12,000 to throw around, maybe we need to renegotiate this whole arrangement. Maybe the price for Clara just went up." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her own father was trying to squeeze more money out of her rescue, treating her like a commodity even now. Jake's expression went deadly calm, and Clara shivered at the ice in his voice when he spoke. "Let me make something very clear, Hartwell. I'm offering to pay your debt out of the goodness of my heart, but if you think you can use that generosity to extort more money out of me, you're about to learn just how wrong you can be." He took another step closer to the platform, and Clara saw several men in the crowd reach for their guns. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take my $12,000, you're going to untie your daughter, and you're going to walk away. Because the alternative is that I pay Blackwood the $12,000 to forgive your debt, and then I explain to him exactly how you tried to sell your own daughter to avoid facing the consequences of your gambling." Thomas went pale. Everyone knew that Marcus Blackwood had a daughter of his own, and rumor had it he didn't take kindly to men who mistreated their families. "You wouldn't," Thomas whispered. Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "Try me." For a long moment, father and rancher stared at each other across the dusty street, and Clara held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to move, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever spell was keeping Jake between her and a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. Then Thomas holstered his gun with shaking hands and nodded to the auctioneer. "Untie her," he said, his voice hollow. "The auction's over." But as the ropes fell away from Clara's wrists and she stumbled down from the platform toward Jake's outstretched hand, she caught sight of her brother Henry's face in the crowd. The expression there made her blood run cold: rage, humiliation, and something that looked like promise of revenge. Clara had a terrible feeling that, even though the auction was over, her troubles were just beginning. Jake's hand closed around hers, warm and steady and strong, and Clara felt safer than she had in weeks. But as he led her away from the crowd, she heard her father's voice calling after them, and the words made her stomach drop. "This isn't over, Morrison. You think you can just walk in here and steal my daughter. You think Blackwood won't find out what really happened here today. You've made enemies, and Clara's going to pay for your interference." Clara looked up at Jake's profile as they walked toward his horse, saw the tight line of his jaw, the way his free hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Jake," she whispered, "what have you done? What have you gotten yourself into by helping me?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious but not unkind. "I've done what needed doing, Clara, and whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." But even as relief flooded through her at his words, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than either of them realized. Jake's ranch sat in a valley between two mountain ridges, hidden from the main roads and protected by natural barriers that made it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. Clara had never been this far from town before, and as they rode up the winding trail, she found herself stealing glances at the man who had just turned his entire life upside down to save her. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree on his land, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for trouble. "Jake," Clara said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the last hour, "you don't even know me. Why did you do it? Why did you risk everything for a stranger?" He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to hide. "You're not a stranger, Clara. I've been watching you for 3 years, ever since you started helping at the church on Sundays. I've seen how you are with the children, how you bring food to the widow Henderson, how you never miss a chance to help someone who needs it. I know who you are, even if we've never had a real conversation." Clara's heart skipped at his words, but before she could respond, Jake held up his hand for silence. He had stopped his horse at the crest of a hill, and Clara could see his entire ranch spread out below them, a modest house, a barn, corrals with horses, and pastures that stretched toward the mountains. But what made Clara's blood run cold was the sight of smoke rising from somewhere near the house. "Someone's been here," Jake said grimly, spurring his horse into a gallop down the slope. Clara followed, her heart pounding as they raced toward whatever was waiting for them. The smoke was coming from Jake's front porch, where someone had built a small fire and left it burning. But it wasn't the fire that made Jake curse under his breath. It was the man sitting in his rocking chair, boots propped up on the porch rail, smoking a cigar like he owned the place. Marcus Blackwood was exactly what Clara had expected and worse. Tall, impeccably dressed despite the remote location, with silver hair and eyes like chips of winter ice. He smiled when he saw them approaching, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Jake Morrison," Blackwood called out as they dismounted, "I have to say I'm impressed. It's not often someone surprises me the way you did today." Jake stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hand resting on his gun. "Blackwood, I didn't expect you to come calling so soon." Marcus laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, I never wait when there's business to discuss. And we definitely have business to discuss, don't we?" Clara could feel the danger radiating from Blackwood like heat from a forge. This was a man who had built his reputation on violence and fear, and even though Jake had paid the debt, she could tell from the way Blackwood was looking at them that this was far from over. "The debt's paid," Jake said evenly. "Thomas Hartwell owes you nothing." "True," Blackwood agreed, flicking ash from his cigar onto Jake's porch. "The original debt is settled, but you see, Jake, you've created a new problem. Word is already spreading about what happened today, how you stood up to a whole town, how you paid $12,000 like it was pocket change, how you took Thomas Hartwell's daughter right out from under everyone's noses. People are starting to wonder if maybe they don't have to be so afraid of Marcus Blackwood anymore." Clara saw Jake's jaw clench. "That's not my problem." "Oh, but it is," Blackwood said softly, standing up from the chair with fluid grace. "You see, reputation is everything in my line of work. If people start thinking they can defy me, if they start believing that some mountain rancher can waltz into town and undo my arrangements, well, that's bad for business. Very bad." He took a step closer, and Clara instinctively moved behind Jake. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take Miss Hartwell back to town. You're going to apologize publicly for your interference, and you're going to let the auction proceed as originally planned." The silence that followed was so charged Clara could practically feel electricity in the air. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Over my dead body." Blackwood's smile widened. "That can certainly be arranged." Before Clara could blink, guns were drawn on both sides. Jake's Colt aimed straight at Blackwood's chest, while two men Clara hadn't even noticed stepped out from behind the barn, rifles trained on Jake. Now," Blackwood said mildly, "no need for unpleasantness." Not yet, anyway. Jake, Clara whispered urgently, please just do what he says, I'm not worth dying for. But Jake never took his eyes off Blackwood. You're wrong about that, Clara. You're worth everything. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, and she felt tears spring to her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, and the fact that this man, this good, brave man, was willing to die for her made her heart feel like it might burst from her chest. But Blackwood just laughed. How touching. True love conquers all, is that it? Well, let me tell you something about love, Jake Morrison. It makes men weak, it makes them stupid, and it's going to get both of you killed. He gestured to his men, who took a step closer. Last chance, take the girl back to town or we end this right here, right now. Clara couldn't stand it anymore. She stepped out from behind Jake, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. Wait, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I'll go back, I'll submit to the auction, just don't hurt him. Clara, no, Jake said fiercely, but she shook her head. This is my choice, Jake, you've done enough. You've already done more than anyone ever has for me. She looked at Blackwood, lifting her chin with a dignity that surprised even her. But I have conditions. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. You're hardly in a position to make demands, my dear. I'm the one you want, Clara said steadily. I'm the one whose sale will prove that people still have to obey you. Without me, you get nothing. So yes, I think I can make a few demands. For a moment, Blackwood actually looked impressed. Go on, Clara took a deep breath. Jake gets safe passage off your territory. He gets to take his money and his horses and leave, and you never bother him again. In exchange, I'll go back to town willingly. I'll tell everyone that I changed my mind, that I want to honor my family's debt. No one will blame you for anything. Jake was staring at her like she'd lost her mind. Clara, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. I understand perfectly, Clara cut him off, her heart breaking as she looked at his stricken face. I understand that this way, at least one of us gets to live. But even as she made the offer, Clara saw something flicker in Blackwood's expression, something calculating and cruel that made her stomach drop. You know, he said slowly, that's not a bad offer, but I think we can do better. He holstered his gun and walked closer, close enough that Clara could smell the expensive cologne he wore. Here's my counteroffer. Jake Morrison, you can keep the girl. Hell, you can marry her tomorrow if you want. But in exchange, you work for me. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? She whispered. Blackwood's smile was sharp as a knife. I mean, Jake here is going to use those impressive skills of his to help me with some business ventures. He's going to help me collect debts, discourage troublemakers, make sure my interests are protected throughout the territory. Think of it as a career change. Jake's gun never wavered. I'll never work for you. Oh, but you will, Blackwood said confidently. Because if you don't, I'll make sure Clara here disappears into the kind of place where pretty girls go in but never come out. I'll make sure she suffers in ways that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your very short life. And then I'll kill you anyway, just for the principle of the thing. Clara saw the moment when Jake realized he was trapped, saw the defeat creep into his eyes despite the steady hand holding his gun. Blackwood had found the one leverage that would work her safety, and Clara knew with terrible certainty that Jake would sacrifice everything, including his own soul, to keep her from harm. How do I know you'll keep your word? Jake asked quietly. How do I know you won't hurt her anyway? Blackwood shrugged. You don't, but it's the only chance she has, and we both know it. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Clara could see Jake weighing his options, could practically see him calculating odds and outcomes. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat and he slowly lowered his gun. If I agree to this, he said, his voice hollow, Clara stays here, on my ranch, safe, untouched. That's not negotiable. Done, Blackwood said immediately, and Clara realized with a chill that the man had been planning this outcome from the beginning. Welcome to my organization, Jake Morrison. I think this is going to be a very profitable partnership. As Blackwood and his men rode away, leaving Jake and Clara alone in the gathering dusk, Clara felt like she might be sick. She had thought the auction was the worst thing that could happen to her, but this was so much worse. Jake had saved her from one fate only to trap himself in another, and it was all her fault. Jake, she whispered, reaching for his hand, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't, don't, Jake said sharply, pulling away from her touch. Don't you dare blame yourself for this." But Clara could see the pain in his eyes, could see how much it was costing him to even look at her. She had wanted to be saved, had dreamed of someone rescuing her from her family's betrayal, but she had never imagined that her rescue would come at such a terrible price. And as she watched Jake walk toward his house, his shoulders bent under the weight of what he had just agreed to, Clara wondered if maybe her father had been right after all. Maybe some prices were just too high to pay, even for love. 3 weeks passed like a slow-burning nightmare. Jake left every morning before dawn and returned after dark, his face carved from stone, his clothes often torn and bloody. He never spoke about where he went or what Blackwood made him do, but Clara could see it eating him alive from the inside out. The gentle man who had saved her was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by someone harder, colder, more dangerous, and Clara felt helpless to stop it. She tried to make his home a refuge, cooking meals that went uneaten, mending clothes that got destroyed again the next day, keeping the house spotless in the hope that something beautiful and clean might remind Jake of who he used to be. But he barely looked at her anymore, barely spoke except for basic necessities. It was like living with a ghost of the man who had risked everything to save her. The worst part was the way he flinched whenever she accidentally touched him, as if her presence was a physical reminder of everything he had lost. On the 22nd day, Jake didn't come home at all. Clara waited up all night, pacing the small living room, jumping at every sound outside. By morning, she was frantic with worry and guilt. She knew she couldn't just sit there wondering if he was dead or dying somewhere while she stayed safe in the house he had traded his soul to protect. So she saddled Jake's spare horse and rode toward town, her heart hammering with fear and determination. She found Jake in the alley behind Murphy's old store, barely conscious and bleeding from a dozen cuts. His knuckles were raw and swollen. His shirt was torn open to reveal bruises that covered his ribs, and there was dried blood in his hair. But it was his eyes that broke Clara's heart. They were empty, defeated, like someone had reached inside him and stolen everything that made him who he was. "Jake," Clara whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh God, what did they make you do?" Jake tried to sit up and immediately fell back against the wall with a groan. "Clara," he said roughly, "what are you doing here? It's not safe. If Blackwood sees you—" "I don't care about Blackwood," Clara said fiercely, pulling out her handkerchief to clean the blood from his face. "I care about you. I care about what this is doing to you." She touched his cheek gently, and for the first time in weeks he didn't pull away. "Jake, we have to find another way. We have to get out of this." "There is no other way," Jake said, his voice flat and hopeless. "I tried to run yesterday, made it almost to the county line before his men caught up with me. They made it very clear what would happen to you if I tried again." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch despite himself. "Clara, I've done things, terrible things. I've hurt people who didn't deserve it, destroyed families, collected debts from widows and orphans. I'm not the man who saved you anymore. I'm not sure I'm a man at all." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she looked at this broken, beautiful man who had sacrificed everything for her. "You're wrong," she said softly. "You're still the man who stood up to my father. You're still the man who paid $12,000 to save a stranger. You're still the man who chose my safety over his own freedom. That hasn't changed, Jake. That will never change." She leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. "And I love you for it. I love you so much it terrifies me." Jake's eyes snapped open, and Clara saw something flicker in their depths, surprise, hope, something that looked almost like the man she remembered. "Clara," he whispered, "you don't know what you're saying. You can't love me, not after what I've become." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Clara replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "I love the man who saved me. I love the man who's suffering to keep me safe. I love the man who's trying so hard to protect me that he's destroying himself. And I'm not going to let you do it anymore." Before Jake could protest, Clara heard the sound of approaching footsteps. They both turned to see Marcus Blackwood emerging from the shadows at the mouth of the alley, flanked by two of his men. His expression was one of cold amusement as he took in the scene, Clara kneeling beside Jake, both of them bloodied and desperate. "How touching," Blackwood said smoothly. "True love in all its glory. Though I have to say, Jake, you look like hell." The Murphy brothers didn't take kindly to having their store burned down, did they? Clara felt horror wash over her as she realized what Jake had been forced to do. The Murphy family had owned that store for 3 generations, and old Mrs. Murphy was bedridden with consumption. "You made him burn down their store," she said, her voice rising with outrage. "They have nothing. They're barely surviving as it is." Blackwood shrugged. "They were 3 months behind on their loan payments. I don't run a charity, Miss Hartwell. Business is business." "You're a monster," Clara said, pushing herself to her feet. She was trembling with anger and disgust, but she faced Blackwood without flinching. "How can you destroy people's lives and call it business? How can you sleep at night?" Blackwood's smile turned dangerous. "Very well, thank you for asking, but I'm afraid your boyfriend here has another appointment today. Don't you, Jake?" Jake struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. "What do you want me to do now?" he asked dully. "The Hendersons have a nice little farm about 5 miles north of here," Blackwood said casually. "They owe me $800 and they've been very creative about avoiding payment. I want you to pay them a visit. Make sure they understand that their time is up." Clara's blood turned to ice. The Hendersons were an elderly couple with a sick granddaughter they were raising. She had been bringing them food and medicine for months, knowing they had nothing left to sell. "Jake, no," she said desperately. "Please, they're good people. They don't deserve this." But Jake was already walking away, his movements mechanical and lifeless. Clara started to follow him, but one of Blackwood's men blocked her path. "Let me go," she said furiously. "Let me go to him." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Blackwood said. "You see, my dear, I've been thinking about our arrangement. Jake is proving to be such a valuable employee that I believe some adjustments are in order." He stepped closer, and Clara could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the scent of violence that clung to him. "You're going to come with me today. You're going to see exactly what your protection is costing." Clara felt panic rise in her throat. "You said I could stay at the ranch. You promised I would be safe." "And you will be," Blackwood assured her, "perfectly safe. Right by my side where I can keep an eye on you. Think of it as insurance. Jake performs better when he knows exactly where you are and exactly how easy it would be for me to hurt you." He gestured to his men, who moved to flank Clara. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, my dear. Jake is suffering enough without having to worry about you fighting us." As they forced her toward their horses, Clara caught one last glimpse of Jake disappearing around the corner. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, wanted to run after him and tell him that none of this was worth it. But she knew that any resistance on her part would only make things worse for him. So she let them put her on a horse, let them lead her away from the alley where the man she loved was slowly dying inside. And she began to plan. Because Clara Hartwell had learned something important in the past few weeks. She had learned that love wasn't just about being protected. It was about protecting the people you cared about in return. And she was done being helpless. She was done watching Jake destroy himself for her sake. It was time to fight back, even if it meant risking everything, especially if it meant risking everything. The Henderson farm was worse than Clara had feared. Jake had arrived ahead of them, and she could see the smoke rising from what had once been the family's barn. Old Tom Henderson stood in his yard, his arm around his wife Martha, both of them staring at the destruction with expressions of numb shock. Their 10-year-old granddaughter Lucy clung to Martha's skirts, coughing violently from the smoke. Clara's heart broke as she watched Jake emerge from behind the house, his face carefully blank, his hands still holding the torch he had used to destroy everything this family had worked for. "Excellent work, Jake," Blackwood called out as they rode up. "Very thorough, very convincing." He turned to Tom Henderson with mock concern. "I do hope this helps clarify the urgency of your situation, Tom. The $800 you owe me plus interest is due by tomorrow at noon. I trust there won't be any more delays." Tom Henderson looked at Jake with eyes full of betrayal and confusion. "Jake Morrison, I've known you for 10 years. Your father and I were friends. How could you do this to us?" Clara saw Jake flinch as if he'd been struck, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten with pain he couldn't show. "Pay your debts, Tom," he said quietly, not meeting the older man's eyes. "Pay them, or next time it won't just be the barn." The words came out flat and emotionless, but Clara could see what they were costing him. Every word was like a knife cutting away another piece of his soul. But then something unexpected happened. Lucy Henderson, barely 10 years old and sick with consumption, stepped away from her grandmother and walked straight up to Jake. She looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only sadness. "Mr. Jake," she said in her small, hoarse voice, "my mama used to tell me stories about you. She said you were the kindest man in the territory. She said you once gave her your horse when hers went lame, and you walked 15 miles home in the snow." Jake's careful mask slipped, and Clara saw raw anguish flash across his face. "Lucy, she said you were a hero," Lucy continued, reaching up to take his hand. "She said if I was ever in trouble, I should find Jake Morrison because he would help me. But you're not helping us now, are you, Mr. Jake?" The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could see Jake struggling, could see the war raging inside him between the man he had been and the man Blackwood was forcing him to become. For a moment she thought he might break, might remember who he really was and find the strength to fight back. But then Blackwood's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "How touching. But I'm afraid Mr. Morrison has new priorities now. Don't you, Jake?" Jake pulled his hand away from Lucy's gentle grip and stepped back. "Pay the debt," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Just pay it." He turned and walked toward his horse, but Clara could see his hands shaking, could see the way his shoulders shook with suppressed emotion, and suddenly she couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't watch the man she loved destroy himself one piece at a time while she sat by helplessly. "Stop," Clara called out, her voice ringing clearly across the farmyard. "All of you just stop." She slid down from her horse before Blackwood's men could stop her and walked to the center of the yard, placing herself between Jake and the family he had just devastated. "This has gone far enough." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Miss Hartwell, I really don't think this is the time for dramatics." "You're right," Clara said, turning to face him with a calm she didn't feel. "It's time for the truth." She looked at Jake, at the Hendersons, at Blackwood's sneering face, and made a decision that would change everything. "Marcus Blackwood," she said clearly, "I challenge you to a deal." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke, and Clara saw surprise flicker across even Blackwood's composed features. "A deal," he repeated. "What kind of deal could you possibly offer me?" Clara lifted her chin, drawing on every ounce of courage she had ever possessed. "A bet. Winner takes all." The silence that followed Clara's words was so complete that she could hear the crackle of burning wood from the Hendersons' destroyed barn. Blackwood stared at her with something between amusement and curiosity, while Jake looked like she had just announced her intention to jump off a cliff. But Clara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for Blackwood's response. "A bet," Blackwood repeated slowly, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "How delightfully unexpected. And what exactly are you proposing to wager, Miss Hartwell? You don't seem to have much in the way of assets." Clara could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I'm wagering myself, my freedom. If I lose, I'll do whatever you want, work for you, marry whoever you choose, disappear forever. Jake goes free. The Hendersons keep their farm, and you get everything you really wanted from the beginning." Jake stepped forward, his face pale with horror. "Clara, no. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning, the answer is no." But Clara didn't take her eyes off Blackwood. "And if I win," she continued, "Jake is free from his contract with you. You forgive every debt in this territory. You pack up your operation and leave, never to return." The Henderson family was watching with growing hope, while Blackwood's men exchanged uncertain glances. Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear girl, even if I were inclined to accept such a ridiculous proposition, what could you possibly do that would constitute a fair contest? You're a farmer's daughter with no money, no connections, no power. What exactly are you planning to bet on? A baking contest?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at his mocking tone, but she had expected this. "I'm betting on my ability to do something you've never been able to do, despite all your money and power and fear." "And what might that be?" Blackwood asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Clara took a deep breath, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would either save everyone she cared about or damn them all. I'm betting I can make every person in this territory stand up to you, together, at the same time, without violence, without threats, without fear. I'm betting I can do what you think is impossible, unite them against you. The silence that followed was different this time, charged with possibility and danger. Clara could see Blackwood calculating, could see the moment when curiosity overcame caution. You have 24 hours, he said finally. If by sunset tomorrow you can get every family in this territory to stand together against me, publicly and without my coercion, then I'll honor your terms. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll honor mine. Jake grabbed Clara's arm, his grip desperate. Clara, this is insane. You don't understand what you're up against. These people are terrified of him. They've seen what happens to anyone who crosses him. They won't risk their families for us. Clara turned to face him, and Jake saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, absolute determination. They won't risk their families for us, she agreed. But they might risk everything for their children's future, for a chance to live without fear. How touching, Blackwood said dryly. But I'm afraid Mr. Morrison is right. Fear is a powerful motivator, Miss Hartwell, more powerful than hope, more reliable than courage. People will choose safety over freedom every time. He mounted his horse with casual arrogance. But by all means, try to prove me wrong. It should be entertaining. As he rode away with his men, Clara felt the full weight of what she had just committed to. 24 hours to accomplish something that seemed impossible. Tom Henderson approached her cautiously, his weathered face creased with worry. Miss Clara, what you did there, standing up to him like that, it was brave. Foolish, maybe, but brave. But Jake's right. People around here are scared. Blackwood's been bleeding this territory dry for years, and anyone who's tried to fight him has ended up dead or worse. Clara nodded, understanding his fear. Mr. Henderson, can I ask you something? If you knew, absolutely knew, that every other family in this territory was going to stand with you, would you stand against him? Tom exchanged glances with his wife, then looked down at his granddaughter who was still coughing from the smoke. If I knew we wouldn't be standing alone, he said slowly, if I knew it would mean Lucy could grow up without fear, then yes, I'd stand. Martha Henderson stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Miss Clara, my husband's right about people being scared, but he's also right about wanting better for our children. The question is, how do you convince everyone to trust each other enough to take that leap? Clara felt a spark of hope at their words. That's exactly what I need to figure out, but I can't do it alone. She turned to Jake, who was staring at her like she had lost her mind. Jake, I need you to help me. I need you to remember who you were before all this started. I need the man who stood up to my father, who faced down an entire town to save a stranger. Jake shook his head. Clara, that man is gone. You've seen what I've become, what I've done. Nobody's going to listen to me now. You're wrong, Clara said fiercely. You think because you've done terrible things under duress, because you've been forced to hurt people to protect me, that makes you a bad man. Look around, Jake. Look at what you've sacrificed for someone you barely knew. Look at what you've endured to keep me safe. That's not the behavior of a bad man. That's the behavior of a hero who's been pushed to his breaking point. Jake's eyes filled with something that might have been tears. I burned their barn, Clara. I destroyed their livelihood. Under threat, Martha Henderson said suddenly. You burned our barn under threat to protect the woman you love. Do you think we don't understand that? Do you think we don't see the difference between a man who chooses evil and a man who's trapped by impossible circumstances? She walked over to Jake and placed a gentle hand on his arm. My husband told you that your father was his friend. Well, your father was a good man, Jake Morrison. And good men raise good sons, even when those sons get lost for a while. Clara saw the moment when something shifted in Jake's expression, saw hope begin to flicker in his eyes like a candle being lit in a dark room. What are you thinking? He asked quietly. Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. I'm thinking about the church picnic next month. I'm thinking about the quilting circle that meets every Wednesday. I'm thinking about how this territory used to be before Blackwood came, when people helped each other, when they shared their burdens, when they stood together against whatever threatened them. Clara, Tom Henderson said slowly, are you talking about getting everyone together in one place? Because that's exactly what Blackwood would expect. He'll have his men watching every gathering, ready to break it up with violence. Clara shook her head. Not one gathering. Dozens. Hundreds. What if we could get people to stand up to him not as a mob, but as individuals making the same choice at the same time? What if we could show him that fear only works when people feel alone? Jake was beginning to understand. You want to coordinate something, get everyone to take the same action simultaneously. Exactly, Clara said, excitement building in her voice. Think about it, Blackwood controls people through isolation. He makes sure they feel like they're facing him alone. But what if, at the exact same moment, every person in this territory did something to show they weren't afraid anymore? Something small, maybe, but visible. Public. Martha Henderson's eyes lit up with understanding. You're talking about a signal, something that says we're all in this together without giving him a chance to stop it before it starts. Clara nodded eagerly. What if every person in this territory took down something Blackwood put up? His wanted posters, his collection notices, his threats. What if at exactly the same time everyone just refused to be intimidated anymore? Tom Henderson was warming to the idea. It could work, he said thoughtfully. People around here aren't cowards, they're just scared and isolated. But if they knew everyone else was taking the same risk at the same time, they'd feel brave, Jake finished, and Clara could see he was beginning to believe it might actually be possible. But how do we coordinate something like that? How do we get word to everyone without Blackwood finding out? Clara smiled, thinking of all the connections she had built over the years through the church, through her work with families in need, through the simple act of being someone people could trust. Leave that to me, she said. I know this territory, Jake. I know these people. I know who talks to who can be trusted, who has the courage to take a leap of faith. She turned to the Hendersons. Will you help us? Will you be our first allies? Tom Henderson looked at his wife, at his granddaughter, at the smoldering ruins of his barn. Then he looked back at Clara with something like wonder in his eyes. Miss Clara, if you can really do this, if you can really bring people together against him, then we're with you, all the way. Martha nodded firmly. Lucy deserves to grow up in a world without Marcus Blackwood. We all do. As they began to plan, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, love and courage could triumph over fear and greed. But even as excitement built in her chest, she was aware of time slipping away. 24 hours to accomplish a miracle. 24 hours to unite a scattered, terrified community against one of the most dangerous men in the territory. And if she failed, she would spend the rest of her life paying for this moment of defiance. But as she looked at Jake's face, saw the man she had fallen in love with beginning to emerge from the shell of the broken person Blackwood had created, Clara knew she had made the right choice. Some things were worth risking everything for. Some fights were worth having, even when the odds seemed impossible. The revolution would begin at dawn, and Clara Hartwell intended to win it. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Clara had barely slept, her mind racing with plans and contingencies, her heart hammering with the weight of what they were attempting. She and Jake had spent the night riding from farm to farm, house to house, sharing their plan in whispered conversations by lamplight. Some people had slammed doors in their faces. Others had listened with growing excitement. A few had cried with relief at the possibility of freedom. But by sunrise, they had commitments from 43 families scattered across the territory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. At exactly noon, when the church bell in town rang 12 times, every person who had agreed to participate would step outside their home, business, or farm and remove one of Blackwood's postings from their property. His collection notices, his wanted posters, his threats and warnings, all of it would come down at the same moment. Then they would wait, together, visible, united. It wasn't violence. It wasn't destruction of property that didn't belong to them. It was simply a collective refusal to display fear. But as Clara stood on Jake's porch watching the sun climb higher in the sky, doubt crept in like poison. What if people lost their nerve at the last moment? What if Blackwood had spies who had already reported their plan? What if 43 families weren't enough to convince him that his power was broken? Jake seemed to sense her thoughts because he moved closer, his presence warm and steady beside her. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "1,000 of them," Clara admitted. "But I keep coming back to the same thing: we can't live like this anymore. You can't live like this anymore. Even if this fails, even if Blackwood makes us pay for trying, at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have fought back." Jake nodded, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "Whatever happens today, Clara, I want you to know something. These past few weeks, watching you refuse to give up hope, watching you find courage even when I had lost mine, you saved me. Not from Blackwood, but from becoming the kind of man who would stop fighting for what's right." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at his words, but before she could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart jumped, fearing it was Blackwood coming early to stop them, but as the riders came into view, she gasped with surprise and relief. It was her brother Henry, accompanied by their father Thomas and half a dozen other men from town. But these weren't Blackwood's men. These were farmers, shopkeepers, men she had known her entire life. Henry dismounted first, his face a mixture of shame and determination. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we heard what you're trying to do. We heard about the bet, about your plan." Thomas Hartwell stepped forward, looking older than Clara remembered, his face etched with guilt and regret. "Clara, what I did to you, what I tried to do, there's no excuse for it. No forgiveness I can ask for, but if you'll let me, if you'll let us, we want to help." Clara stared at her father in shock. "You want to help? After everything that's happened, after you tried to sell me like cattle?" Thomas flinched as if she had struck him. "I was desperate, Clara, terrified. But that's no excuse for what I did to you, for betraying my own daughter. I've had weeks to think about it, weeks to realize that I became exactly the kind of man I always despised, a coward who would sacrifice his family to save himself." "We all did," Henry added, his voice thick with shame. "We all stood by and watched Blackwood destroy this territory because we were too scared to fight back. But watching you stand up to him yesterday, seeing you risk everything for people you barely know, it reminded us who we used to be before fear made us into something less." One of the other men, Clara recognized him as Samuel Wright, who owned the feed store, stepped forward. "Miss Clara, we've been talking all night about what this territory was like before Blackwood came, about what it could be like again if we had the courage to make it happen." Clara felt hope bloom in her chest, but she forced herself to be cautious. "What are you saying exactly? Are you saying you want to join us?" Thomas nodded firmly. "We're saying we're already in, all of us, and we've been spreading the word since before dawn. The number isn't 43 families anymore, Clara, it's 78 and growing." Clara's knees nearly gave out with relief and disbelief. 78 families, are you sure? Are they really committed to this?" "They're committed," Samuel Wright said with conviction, "because you reminded them of something they had forgotten. That courage is contagious. When one person stands up, it makes it easier for the next person to stand up too. And when enough people stand together, fear loses its power." Jake was staring at the group of men with something like wonder. "You're really doing this? You're really going to face him down?" Henry looked directly at Jake, and Clara could see the guilt in her brother's eyes. "Jake Morrison, I owe you an apology. A dozen apologies. When you stood up for my sister, when you risked everything to save her, I should have stood with you. Instead, I let pride and shame make me your enemy." "You don't owe me anything," Jake said quietly. "I did what I had to do." "No," Henry said firmly. "You did what was right, and today we're all going to do what's right, together." As if summoned by his words, more riders appeared on the horizon. Clara shaded her eyes against the morning sun and felt her heart soar as she recognized face after face. The widow Henderson with her grown sons, the Miller family with their teenage daughters, old Pete who ran the blacksmith shop, the Schmidt family who farmed the North Ridge. Dozens of people, all converging on Jake's ranch with expressions of determination and hope. By 10 o'clock, the yard was full of horses and wagons, and more people than Clara had ever seen in one place outside of church on Easter Sunday. Children played in the grass while their parents talked in low, urgent voices about the plan, about the risk, about the future they might be able to build if they succeeded. Clara moved through the crowd, checking in with families, answering questions, trying to project confidence even though her stomach was churning with nerves. But it was the conversation she overheard between two of the older women that really drove home what they were attempting. "Martha," one was saying to the other, "what if this doesn't work? What if Blackwood just laughs at us and makes things worse?" Martha, Clara realized it was Martha Henderson, replied with steel in her voice, "Then at least our children will know we tried. At least they'll know there was a day when their parents chose to fight instead of submit." At 11:30, Jake called for everyone's attention. The crowd gathered around him, faces upturned with expectation and trust. "In 30 minutes, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "we're going to do something that will change this territory forever. Some of you are scared, hell, I'm scared too. But Clara Hartwell reminded me of something important yesterday. She reminded me that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. It just means being brave matters more." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Clara felt tears of pride and love fill her eyes. This was the Jake Morrison she had fallen for, the man who could inspire others, who could make people believe in something better. "When that church bell rings," Jake continued, "we're not just taking down pieces of paper. We're taking back our lives. We're taking back our territory. We're showing Marcus Blackwood that fear only works when people stand alone, and we're not standing alone anymore." The crowd began to disperse, families heading back to their homes and businesses to wait for the signal. Clara found herself standing with Jake, her father, and her brother as the yard emptied. The silence felt charged with possibility and danger. "Clara," Thomas said quietly, "whatever happens today, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, prouder than I've ever been of anything in my life. You've shown more courage in the past day than I've shown in years." Clara looked at her father, this man who had betrayed her so completely just weeks ago, and felt something inside her chest loosen and heal. "I forgive you, Papa," she said softly. "I forgive all of us. We're all just people trying to do the best we can." Henry reached out and squeezed her hand. "When this is over," he said, "when Blackwood is gone, I want us to be a family again, a real family, the kind that stands together no matter what." At 11:55, Clara and Jake rode toward town, positioning themselves where they could see the church bell tower and coordinate the signal. The streets were eerily quiet, but Clara could sense the tension in the air, could feel the presence of people waiting behind closed doors and shuttered windows. At exactly noon, the church bell began to toll, its deep bronze voice echoing off the canyon walls. 1, 2, 3. Clara held her breath, watching windows and doorways. 4, 5, 6. Nothing yet, but she could feel the anticipation building. 7, 8, 9. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure Jake could hear it. 10, 11, 12. For a moment that felt like eternity, nothing happened. The street remained empty, the silence complete. Then, like flowers blooming after rain, doors began to open. People stepped out onto porches, into yards, onto the main street of town. Clara saw Mrs. Patterson tear down a collection notice from her boarding house door. She saw the Miller boys pulling wanted posters off the fence posts around their family store. She saw old Pete emerge from his blacksmith shop with a piece of paper in his hands that he crumpled and threw into the street with ceremonial dignity. All over town, all across the territory, people were stepping into the light and saying no to fear. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the impossible become reality. They had done it. They had actually done it. 78 families had found the courage to stand together, and Marcus Blackwood's power was crumbling like a house built on sand. But even as joy and relief flooded through her, Clara knew the real test was yet to come. Because somewhere in this territory, Marcus Blackwood was learning that his reign of terror was over, and men like Marcus Blackwood didn't go quietly into the night. Marcus Blackwood arrived in town at exactly 1 o'clock, flanked by a dozen armed men, his face a mask of cold fury that made Clara's blood run cold. The people who had stood so bravely just an hour before began to retreat into doorways and behind windows, but they didn't disappear entirely. They stayed visible, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara and Jake positioned themselves in the center of Main Street, and Clara felt her heart hammering as Blackwood dismounted and walked toward them with predatory grace. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air, "I have to admit, Miss Hartwell, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you." He gestured to the crumpled papers littering the street, the torn posters, the visible signs of defiance. "Quite the little rebellion you've organized. Very touching, very inspiring, completely pointless but inspiring nonetheless." Clara lifted her chin, drawing strength from Jake's presence beside her, and the knowledge that dozens of people were watching from windows and doorways. "It's not pointless," Clara said steadily. "Look around you, Blackwood, look at what's happened here. Your power depended on keeping people isolated and afraid, but they're not isolated anymore. They're not afraid anymore. You've lost." Blackwood laughed, the sound like glass breaking in the quiet street. "Oh, my dear naive girl, I haven't lost anything. So a few dozen farmers tore down some papers. So what? Do you really think that changes anything? Do you think it makes them bulletproof?" He gestured to his men, who began to spread out along the street, hands resting on their guns. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make an example of a few of these brave souls, starting with the Henderson family, I think. Maybe the Millers, too. A little violence, a few tragic accidents, and all these courageous people will remember why they were afraid in the first place." Clara felt ice form in her stomach as she realized Blackwood was right. Standing together had been the first step, but it wouldn't mean anything if people could still be murdered for their defiance. But then something unexpected happened. Tom Henderson stepped out of the crowd, his weathered hands empty but his expression resolute. "Marcus Blackwood," he called out in a voice that carried across the entire street, "I want to thank you." Blackwood paused, clearly not expecting this response. "Thank me," Tom nodded, walking closer until he stood just a few feet from the man who had terrorized him for years. "You see, I've been afraid for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be a man. I'd forgotten what it meant to stand up for what's right, to protect the people I love, to choose courage over comfort." "Touching," Blackwood said dryly, but Clara could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "But I'm afraid your newfound courage won't stop bullets." Tom smiled, and Clara was amazed to see genuine peace in his expression. "Maybe not, but you know what? I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees, and I'm not standing alone." As if his words were a signal, more people began to emerge from doorways and step into the street. Henry Hartwell, his jaw set with determination. Martha Henderson, her hands clasped tightly but her spine straight. Samuel Wright, the Miller family, old Pete, dozens of others. They formed a loose circle around Blackwood and his men, not threatening, not violent, just present, visible, united. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she realized what was happening. 6 months had passed since Marcus Blackwood rode out of their territory, and the changes were visible everywhere Clara looked. The Henderson farm had a new barn, bigger and sturdier than the one that had burned. The Miller family had expanded their store, adding a small lending library that had become the heart of the community's social life. Main Street bustled with activity as businesses reopened and new families moved in, drawn by stories of a territory where people stood together against tyranny. But it was the smaller changes that meant the most to Clara. The way children played freely in the streets without their mothers hovering anxiously nearby. The way men gathered on porches in the evenings to talk about crops and weather instead of debts and threats. The way women organized quilting circles and church socials without fear that their gatherings might be seen as seditious. Fear had been replaced by hope, and hope had bloomed into something beautiful. Clara stood in the doorway of the small house she and Jake had built together on the ridge overlooking town, one hand resting on her growing belly, watching her husband work with a group of men to raise the frame for what would become the territory's first real school. They had been married 3 weeks after Blackwood's departure, in a ceremony that had drawn families from 3 counties. Even the territorial governor had attended, presenting them with an official commendation for their role in ending Blackwood's reign of terror. "You're supposed to be resting," Jake called out, catching sight of her in the doorway. Clara smiled, rubbing her belly affectionately. "The baby's not due for another 3 months, Jake Morrison. I'm pregnant, not made of glass." But she appreciated his concern, treasured the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. After everything they had been through, after all the darkness they had endured, the simple joy of planning for their child's future felt like a miracle. Thomas Hartwell approached the house, his arms full of lumber and his face bright with the kind of contentment Clara hadn't seen in him since before her mother's death. Her father had thrown himself into community rebuilding projects with the fervor of a man seeking redemption, and Clara was amazed by how much their relationship had healed. "How's my grandbaby doing today?" he asked, setting down the lumber and wiping sweat from his brow. "Active," Clara replied, pressing her hand to a particularly enthusiastic kick. "I think he's going to be a handful." Thomas's eyes softened with emotion. He or she is going to be raised in a world where people know how to fight for what's right. That's the best gift we could give any child. Clara nodded, thinking about the stories they would tell their son or daughter, stories about courage and community, about the day an entire territory chose love over fear. Henry approached with little Lucy Henderson perched on his shoulders, both of them laughing about something Lucy had whispered in his ear. Clara's brother had surprised everyone by asking to court Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's daughter, and their engagement had been announced just last week. "Clara," Henry called out, "Lucy wants to know if the baby will be able to play with her when it's born." Clara laughed, reaching out to ruffle Lucy's hair. The little girl's consumption had improved dramatically once the stress and fear were removed from her life, and she had become the unofficial mascot of the community's children. "The baby won't be able to play for a while," Clara explained gently, "but when he or she gets bigger, I'm sure they'll be great friends." Lucy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "I'll teach them how to whistle like Uncle Henry taught me." The sound of her clear, sweet whistle carried across the construction site, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple joy of it. 6 months ago, this child had been coughing up blood in the ruins of her family's barn. Now she was planning playmates and practicing skills that had nothing to do with survival. As the afternoon wore on, more families arrived to help with the school construction. The Wrights brought fresh bread and cold well water. The Pattersons contributed window glass they had ordered special from the territorial capital. The Schmidt family arrived with their 4 sons, all eager to help with the heavy lifting. It had become a pattern in their territory. When one family needed help, everyone pitched in. When one family celebrated, everyone shared the joy. Jake climbed down from the school's frame and walked over to Clara, his shirt damp with sweat and his face glowing with satisfaction. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the half-built structure. "Will our child be proud to attend the Marcus Blackwood Memorial School for future troublemakers?" Clara burst into laughter at his joke, then sobered as she really looked at what they were building. "Jake, this is incredible. When I think about what this place was like 6 months ago, and what it's becoming now." "You did this," Jake said softly, pulling her into his arms despite the protest of his sweat-soaked shirt. "You made all of this possible." Clara shook her head, looking around at the dozens of people working together, laughing together, building something beautiful together. "We did this, all of us, and we're going to keep doing it for our children and their children." Jake's kiss was gentle and full of promise, and Clara could taste the future in it. Birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, all of them spent in a place where love had conquered fear. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the community gathered for their traditional weekly meal. It had started as a practical arrangement, pooling resources to make sure everyone had enough to eat, but had evolved into something much more meaningful. Long tables were set up in the town square, laden with dishes that represented the heritage of every family in the territory. Children ran between the tables while adults shared news, made plans, and simply enjoyed the pleasure of each other's company. Clara found herself seated between Jake and her father, with Henry and Sarah across from them, surrounded by the faces of people who had become more than neighbors. They had become family. "I want to propose a toast," Thomas Hartwell said, rising with his glass of apple cider. "To my daughter Clara, who taught us all that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the refusal to let fear win." The cheer that went up from the crowd was warm and genuine, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and pleasure. "And to Jake Morrison," Henry added, standing as well, "who showed us that protecting the people you love sometimes means risking everything you have." Another cheer, this one accompanied by the clink of glasses and the sound of children clapping. But it was Tom Henderson who offered the toast that brought tears to Clara's eyes. "To all of us," the old farmer said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "for learning that the most powerful force in the world isn't fear or greed or violence. It's ordinary people choosing to